Well, today I have a very special guest, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Sir John Key. I'm going to ask him about being friends with President Xi Jinping, Donald Trump's role in damaging international perceptions of China, and the upcoming 50-year anniversary of official ties between New Zealand and China. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Borham. Let's get reporting. It's an absolute honour to have today's guest on the show. He was New Zealand's leader from 2008 to 2016. He guided the country through the global financial crisis, and he helped us deal with the massive Christchurch earthquakes of 2010 and 2011. Sir John Key, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, Daja How. Nice to see you, Andy.
This year marks 50 years of official relations between New Zealand and China. And of course, we know unofficial relations go back much further to the mid-1800s yes. during the famous gold rush era. So we've been through quite a lot, many ups and downs. But where do you think the relationship stands today in 2022? And how important is that relationship to both sides?
Well, it's moved on vastly in the last 50 years. I mean, it's come from a very limited interaction, really, as you pointed out. You know, some movement of people, some exchange of goods and services prior to that, but really the formal recognition on both sides happened 50 years ago. And now China, of course, has emerged as our largest trading partner for goods and services up until and pre-COVID, the largest source of foreign students and our second largest source of tourists, only eclipsed by Australia. So China is critically important to New Zealand's success. And I'd like to think from a Chinese point of view, obviously we're a tiny little country at the bottom of the world, but we are an important supplier for things that Chinese consumers really value, like high quality food and very safe food. So, yep, we've come a long way in that 50 years. And I think we understand each other better and have built, on both sides, actually, a mutually respectful relationship.
Now, obviously, 1972 was a big year for New Zealand-China relations with the commencement of official ties. And then early in 2008, just before you were elected Prime Minister, we became the first ever developed country to sign a free trade agreement with China. So I was wondering, under your leadership from 2008 to 2016, how did the New Zealand-China relationship develop?
Well, I came into politics in 2002, and I came with a slightly unusual background, really. I came from investment banking. So at that point, I was running global foreign exchange and bond trading in Europe for Merrill Lynch, and I retired to come back and run. And so I could already see China as, emerging very rapidly as a huge economy and a great opportunity for New Zealand. And by the time I became Prime Minister in 2008, we were in the starting point of the global financial crisis, really. And I think China played a very critical role during that crisis. It was the third leg of the stool, really, because the United States and Europe were faltering, and it was the Chinese economy that really lifted everyone out of that, and particularly New Zealand. So I knew that they would be really important. As you say, the previous government had just signed the FTA, and during our time, we really tried to build and strengthen that relationship, and that meant that I had 7 state visits to China as Prime Minister. I think at one point every member of the Politburo came to New Zealand in an 18-month period. Xi Jinping came as President, as indeed he had come as Vice President when I was, just in the early days of being Prime Minister. And of course, we extended the free trade agreement to all parts of one China with Beijing's blessing, so Taiwan and Hong Kong. So it was really the relationship in many senses, but certainly in an economic sense, went from strength to strength.
Oh, nice. And you just mentioned you visited in an official capacity 7 times. So during that time, you managed to become close friends with President Xi Jinping. And you even came to China in 2019 in a personal capacity and met up with him. So I was wondering how it was that you guys became friends, and maybe if you have any memorable stories to share of that relationship.
Yeah, well, he came in, as I said, when I first became Prime Minister. I think it must have been 2009. And as you probably know, the grounds of Parliament are controlled in New Zealand by the Speaker, not actually by you as Prime Minister. And so we welcomed him into Parliament. And one of the Green MPs, who was reasonably radical anyway, he decided he was going to do a protest, which we couldn't stop him doing, and stand on the forecourt of Parliament. That bit, we sort of understood. But during the middle of the president coming, or at that point vice president effectively coming into the New Zealand Parliament, he brought out a Tibetan flag and started waving it. And obviously that was a very, very difficult time. And I think on the Chinese side they were genuinely both embarrassed and sort of pretty angry that we'd let that happen. But I went back to China, as it turned out, for a different reason a few months later, and had dinner with President Xi. And he was very gracious. He said, look, we understand, different countries have different systems. We understand the right for people to protest in a country like yours. And of course, we would prefer that wasn't happening. But we have to accept that. And I had bought him a personal gift, really, to sort of say sorry and say, look, whatever the situation, the fact that I can't control that place is true, but equally I probably should have done more as Prime Minister to make sure that that situation couldn't arise. And it's really from there that we built a great relationship. And look, every time I came to China, the leadership were incredibly both accommodating and encouraging, did everything they could to make the trip successful, and really rolled out literally the red carpet for us on every occasion. So inevitably that relationship, sort of grew. And of course I saw both the Premier and the President at numerous different events, from APEC to East Asian Summit to the G20. So there were lots of other occasions as well. So look, I would count him as a friend. I think I've got to know him pretty well. Obviously, he doesn't speak English, and sadly I don't speak a lot of Chinese. But within the confines of that, and very different political systems, I think everyone needs to accept that. Very different systems. We've built a level of mutual respect, which I think has been really important. And hopefully, I've been a voice for some reason and rational debate about China, because we can talk about it, but obviously post the sort of Donald Trump era, things have really deteriorated, and I've tried to just put a bit of reason into that debate from my perspective of what I've seen and what I believe will happen.
Yeah, I think you've been a really important voice for a reasonable discussion on China. But I know that in New Zealand there's a lot of so-called China experts who have criticised your ongoing connections with China, which I personally can't understand myself. So what would you have to say to people who think that disconnecting and cutting ties is somehow the way to go?
Well, firstly, you'd have to say, show me any relationship where that helps build a better relationship when you cut people off or you spend your life yelling and screaming at them. And, how does that really change anything? And let's just argue for a moment that over the decades of debates we've had, of course we have different perspectives on some issues. It might be aspects of human rights, or it might be, different things. There's, the South China Seas, for instance, there's been some discussions about how things might be interpreted. But the reality is that actually you get progress in any relationship, and actually progress on important issues, from climate change to trade to whatever, when you have a good working relationship, not when you're standing at 10 paces shouting with each other. Secondly, I think there's just been a lot of, there's been a lot of reasons why people have wanted to create this sort of China as the bogeyman, if you like, that they're on the precipice of invading Taiwan and all of these things that I don't believe are true. And the other thing that I think is really worth getting a bit of perspective on is that New Zealand is far from being alone. We were the first country to recognise China as a market-based economy, but pretty much most major westernised democracies recognise China's territorial authority over Hong Kong, over Taiwan. This is not new. We have a one China policy, as does Australia and America and many other countries. And by that we say one country, many systems. And I think, it's useful for the people that don't like China and don't like them emerging as a superpower and want to argue that they're a military threat or whatever, to sort of raise the arguments that somehow they're going to invade. But I don't think personally in my lifetime that will happen. I think, would the Chinese ever relinquish their territorial rights? Well, no. But actually, are the Americans going to relinquish their territorial rights to Alaska or Washington or anywhere else? No. Do every policy that Australia or the US or Canada, our traditional allies have, we agree with? No. So let's just get a bit of perspective. And finally, there's a massive opportunity there. So, yeah, I'm not being silly about it, but I think we do have a very strong trading relationship. And China just simply has a massive middle class and is going to lift more and more people out of poverty into that middle class. So they represent a great opportunity for New Zealand to do well and for New Zealand businesses and individuals to succeed.
Yeah, I think one of the key things you just mentioned is the One China policy. A lot of New Zealanders who are new to, for example, when Nancy Pelosi visited earlier this year, it was new to them and they had no idea about the One China policy. But as you say, nothing's really changed for a long time. This is how we've always viewed China and Taiwan.
And I thought that was pretty reckless, actually, when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, because, look, she's had a long view of things. To be fair to Nancy Pelosi, she hasn't changed. And she's been critical of China and anti-China and all that sort of stuff. But, she's retiring. She's at the end of her political career. To go and take a delegation to Taiwan is really poking the bear, isn't it? I mean, you're not achieving anything. All you're doing is putting some friction into things and really, kind of forcing a response from Beijing. Actually, I thought Beijing was pretty measured in their response, as they were actually when there were problems, some time ago in Hong Kong. I mean, they're not, despite what people might say, in my opinion, they're not out there looking for a fight. They are out there looking to take people out of poverty. Yep, they will never relinquish their territorial rights, but I don't think New Zealand would relinquish its territorial rights.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind how measured China is, because if you read a lot of Western media reports, it's anything but. But I always felt with Nancy Pelosi that she was kind of trying to go out with a bang. Did you get that feeling as well?
Yeah, she had nothing to lose, and that's why I say it's reckless, because it's fine for Nancy Pelosi to make a political statement about Nancy and her beliefs, but you really, this thing, there's some tension there, and there are risks that things go wrong, and you've got countries like America saying, they would defend Taiwan. So you're really putting, I think a lot of excessive friction in the relationship, and unnecessary. For what reason? I mean, there have been long, as you will know better than anyone, long held polls or research done on whether the Taiwanese people want to break away from the mainland. And the vast overwhelming bulk, 85%, vote to stay. Well, I think if you went and asked the people of Quebec whether they want to leave Canada, you wouldn't get 85% of people saying they want to stay. So these things aren't unusual that you get people with a different perspective, but the majority of people want to stay, and the majority of people can see actually that the relationship with the mainland is an important one, just as an important one from New Zealand's perspective.
You mentioned before that the Western view of China deteriorated somewhat under the presidency of Donald Trump, who somehow managed to change people's perceptions of China into that of a threat, I guess. Unfortunately, that also extends to the perceptions of many ordinary Kiwis. So what is it, do you think, that ordinary people get so wrong about China?
Yeah, I mean, the tragedy of all this is that, if you take it all the way back to when I first became Prime Minister in 2008 and you sort of retrace those 7 visits, they were popular. People liked the fact that we were engaging with the leadership. They liked the fact that the ties were growing. They liked the fact that we were doing well, and they could see the opportunities. They saw China as a real source for opportunity and good. And, yeah, they recognised there were some issues where there would be debates, but as I said, that's standard. I think Donald Trump really, he's always been anti-trade anyway. I mean, the first thing he did when he came into office was rip up TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which New Zealand was a member of, and gave us an opportunity to have a free trade deal with the US. And he measures trade. He just doesn't like trade anyway. And then because there's a big trade imbalance between the United States and China, he perceives that to be the US losing and China winning. The fact that the reason there's such a big imbalance is because China produces a lot of stuff that US consumers want to buy seems to be very lost on him. So he needed to create, for those people that voted him, those blue-collar workers, a reason why they were doing badly, going backwards. And the easiest way to do that was to create this sort of, I think, synopsis that, China didn't play fair and it stole intellectual property and it did all these different things. And that, it was going to get militarily more aggressive and, they were a real threat. And I think a lot of people believe those kinds of things. But look at any country that emerges as a superpower. And at the moment in the world, there's only the United States. China's getting there. They have a massive military. It's what countries do when they get wealthier. They always build some military capability. As said earlier, do we agree with every policy in the US? Not at all. When conflict has come up, whether it's frankly actually been Tiananmen Square, or whether it's been Hong Kong recently, or whether it's been the most recent issues in the protests that were reported over COVID and the zero COVID policy, actually the Chinese leadership's been very, very cautious about the way it's addressed those, and actually always very responsive. I mean, even though you don't live in a democratic system, their leadership, starting right back with Hu Jintao, maybe earlier than that, but in the time that I've been involved, the Chinese leadership's been very, very, with Wen Jiabao and in recent times Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, been very, very engaged with the populace. So I think it's just one of those things that China has a very different culture to ours. It's large, people feel threatened by those things. And, there are some things that we want to work with them on. But if you want to deal with big issues like, better trade around the world, if you want to deal with issues like climate change, all of these kinds of things, the only way to achieve that is with China in the room. So, there's a bit of a myth that goes around that President Obama started this relationship of cozying up to China, and the reason it's all gone so bad is because, they didn't play their part. That's not true. I think Donald Trump just changed the narrative, and unfortunately, that's been adopted by both sides of the political environment in the US, and that has led to traditional partners of the US, like even New Zealand, being more critical. Now, I think to be fair to the New Zealand government, they are trying to navigate a more nuanced line there. But you can see in Australia for a long time now that, they've seen themselves as the sheriff of the South, and their leadership's been very aggressive towards China.
So how do you rate the current New Zealand government's relationship with China?
Well, they're the opposition to us. I mean, and we lost the 2017 election. I retired in basically the end of 2016. And, it was an interesting one, actually. Our leader and then Prime Minister Bill English scored a lot more points and a lot more votes. But we have the German system, and so you can collect all these parties, and it's what we might term the coalition of the losers, but they eventually got there. I think the right of politics will always be in New Zealand more forward-leaning when it comes to China. And if there's a change of government next year, I'd expect them to be a bit more friendly towards China. But it is, there's no question that a lot of damage has been done. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Chinese themselves have, after a period of time, been fighting back against a lot of this, negative commentary. And I think, I think you will see the president and the new leadership being more forthright in defending its position and not allowing it to be trampled over. So, I mean, the big hope really is that everyone around the world, takes a breather and says, look, we're better when we all try and work collectively together. And China's very critical in some relationships around the world. I mean, it has a much better relationship with Russia, for instance. I mean, most countries in the world now see Russia as a pariah. I think, again, China's been careful when it comes to Russia and the Ukraine war, but they can play an important part. With North Korea, for instance, the North Koreans probably don't listen to anyone, but they do listen to the Chinese leadership, probably even Iran. So, the world is better to embrace China and have it as a more friendly voice when it comes to what I think are really rogue states, not the sort of thing that people create as a myth and is incorrect.
Yeah, I think myth is the key word there. I think what a lot of people's understanding of China is based on Western media representations, which I think are often very unfair. So one of the things I always try to suggest to friends and family who have negative views of China is just to come and visit and see the place with their own eyes. So with China obviously slowly dismantling its COVID-0 policy and looking to open up again to the outside world after 3 years of closed borders, how important do you feel these kind of people-to-people exchanges are?
Oh, they're absolutely critical. I mean, firstly, it's a very cultural thing. But, in Chinese culture, I think, face-to-face meetings and, respectful, dialogue is hugely important. I think, because you have language barriers sometimes and things, it's difficult when you don't have that opportunity to sit down with one another. And so, look, I mean, as soon as I can get back, I will. There are reports that Xi Jinping and the current New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern are working on a trip. I'd welcome that. I think that's good. obviously zero COVID and also difficult COVID rules in New Zealand have stopped that for the last 2.5, 3 years. But I mean, my sense of it is, and all the messages that we seem to get out of the administration in China, is by Q2 of next year we should be able to get back to China. And I think, that's critically important. There's nothing like sitting there, and also there's a new leadership lineup now, so getting to meet some of the new players and develop relationships with them is important.
Hey, New Zealand also has, quite a huge population who identify as Chinese. I think it was around 250,000 at the last census.
Yes.
So what is it about New Zealand that you think Chinese people love so much?
Oh, look, I think in many respects, you always want the things you probably can't have. And so, China's a vastly densely populated population, biggest in the world. We're, one of the smaller. We have very high standard of living, good education, good health care, all of those kinds of things. We've been welcoming to Chinese visitors. We've wanted them to come and to stay and live in New Zealand. Lots of students have come. I set up policies where if you came to New Zealand as a student, more often than not, you could actually stay in the country. And so lots of people, were educated in New Zealand and stayed. And we've had, great interactions between our universities, with Tsinghua and Peking University, with Auckland, Canterbury, and Otago and the like. So, it's I think it stems all the way back. I mean, as you pointed out in the intro, I mean, our relationship doesn't just go back 50 years. I mean, Chinese migrants came during the gold rush. Ri Ali's very famous for his time in China and his relationship. There's been lots of different people that have tried to bind the countries together. But I think there's just no question that you believe people and the diaspora of any country plays an important role in the way that you view what's going on. Because people are much more likely to believe a friend or a family member than they are something they see in the media, certainly in a normal westernised democracy like New Zealand. So, from our point of view, what we would sort of say is that the more that people get, as to your point, first-hand experience there and can see that a lot of the things that they're led to believe aren't actually true, the better they'll feel about that. And I think we just need to be a little realistic. I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with us saying, hey, we think, this would be an area where we could work more constructively together, or this is an outcome we'd like to see. Just like the Chinese will have their own shopping list of things for the world. It's not a one-way traffic here. We don't all get to dictate to China, and they don't get a chance to say, hey, these things are important to us. But if you look at it, China, I think what a lot of people don't understand about China is that under Xi Jinping, and certainly in the last 10 years and plus, they have been working very hard to develop a very techno-savvy economy, a very efficient economy, a well-educated economy. So, they've gone from, again, producing very low-value goods, like the Singaporeans did decades ago, to producing very high-quality goods. And so, we always think, what are we going to get out of China? Well, the answer is some very, very sophisticated responses and outcomes. And, you can see that. Look at Taiwan. I mean, they actually produce, as the biggest computer chip manufacturers in the world. They are immensely difficult to make. And, Taiwan has managed to do that. So it sort of shows you Chinese capability is very strong.
Now, as someone who's visited China many times, I was wondering if there's anything you learned or any preconceived ideas you might have had beforehand that were changed after your visits here.
Well, I think people have more freedoms in what they say. Okay, it's different. It's probably different from New Zealand. It's a slightly different system. People don't vote, and the state media has a bigger influence. So accept all those kind of things. But actually, people are they're very commercial. They work hard. There isn't a lot of a big welfare safety net, so you live and die off your own energy and effort, and that's a good thing that people believe they can transform their lives, and they do. But there's a flourishing market economy there that operates well. And there's some very, very beautiful parts of China. I've been lucky to visit to lots of different places. It's a very diverse country. I mean, it's got some amazing history. If you think about things like Forbidden City or Tiananmen Square or the Great Wall of China, of course. right through the pandas in Chengdu, which we got to visit one time. So, yeah, I mean, to me, we think we understand China because a few of us have been to Shanghai and even fewer have been to Beijing. But as you know better than anyone's living there, there are cities that most of us can't spell or pronounce that are bigger than the biggest city in New Zealand by a country mile. And that's the opportunity, is getting into that second tier, really.
Yeah, there's so many huge places people have just never heard of. I think as you said, Shanghai and Beijing, very, very, how would you say, not westernized, but quite international. So I really recommend people venture further in. You mentioned before some of China's amazing accomplishments over the past few decades, including lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty, building thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail, and now producing more renewable energy than any other country in the world. So I was wondering if you think there's anything in New Zealand that we could learn from some of China's success stories.
Oh, the capacity to deliver infrastructure is amazing. I mean, we like to think we were an infrastructure government, and we built quite a lot of infrastructure, from ultra-fast broadband to a lot more, motorway networks and renewable energy in New Zealand. But if the Chinese had the opportunity to build it, they'd get it done in, half the price in about a tenth of the time. I mean, it's scary, how good they are. And we've all seen those videos of them putting up hospitals in, 3 days. And I mean, it's just mind-blowing. And I think, that's what New Zealanders don't understand. If you go and talk to them about Belt and Road, they have no idea that that's probably $1 trillion expenditure, a replica of the old Silk Road, but done in a modern way of linking China through to Europe, and think of those massive opportunities. And I think that's the point, isn't it? That whatever an individual country thinks, you can turn your back on China if you want. You can say, I don't want to deal with you, I don't want to trade with you, I don't want to engage with you. Fine. I mean, that's probably the relationship New Zealand has with Russia, fundamentally. It really doesn't engage in any material way. It had a better relationship when I was around, actually, but things have deteriorated, and for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, we don't support what President Putin's been doing in Ukraine and all of those things, and we feel for the people of Ukraine. So I understand all that. But the question is, does it change anything? I mean, China will still go off and buy dairy and butter and all sorts of manner of things from other countries who will supply them. So to me, I think it's far better to have a constructive relationship where you do actually engage with one another, and trade brings countries together. And then over time, you'll work on those things. But people also have to be realistic. I mean, if you look at climate change, I sat next to Xi Jinping at lunch once, and he was telling me about how he really wanted to build a science-based economy, a very clean economy, environmentally very friendly economy. And to your point, they're doing a lot around climate change, which, then you go to, say, Australia, and I was there last week, or yesterday, in fact. Well, the greatest respect to the Australians, they're still digging up an awful lot of coal and burning it, So we're quite good at telling other countries what to do, and not necessarily always good at doing exactly the same thing ourselves.
Yeah, I agree with that. So looking forward to the future, how can New Zealand and China maintain or even improve the relationship? And I was wondering where you would love to see that relationship head in an ideal world.
Well, in an ideal world, go from strength to strength, because then New Zealand will become even a more trusted voice in China. And there are times where it's important that we make a point on behalf of westernised countries and say, look, there's got to be a bit of give and take. And I think we need to be realistic about that. I mean, I'm on the board of the largest cybersecurity company in the world. I mean, people are concerned about the cyber activity that sometimes can be traced back to China or Russia and the likes. I suspect not all of that activity is state-based. And I think the Chinese leadership probably could do a pretty good job, actually, of closing that down, because it does damage their reputation in the West and does give an opportunity for them to be attacked. So I think, but that's about having constructive relationship and talking to them about things that really matter. But, I mean, I would say, look, if we don't treat the relationship well, but we treat it in an average way, in 50 years, what will it look like 100 years on at the start of the formal relationship? Obviously a lot bigger than it is today. But that's a very low bar and very low aspiration. If we do work really hard, then we could have a magnificent relationship, and China could be a really important counterpart, and New Zealand could be seen as a really important go-between and voice, actually, for other countries into China. And so I think we've got to work on that relationship. As I say, we've got to work on mutual trust. We've got to work on ways to communicate messages to one another, which is seen as helpful. And I think, look, what goes around comes around. if in 2008 the world was like, we want to embrace China, in 2016 we want to jettison China, mark my words, mainstream thinking will come back to wanting to embrace China again. It will, because the economic opportunities are vast, and whether people like it or not, and some people don't, China's domestic economy is so significant now, it can fund most of its own growth and its own development. So it relies far less on the Western world. It's just a question of how much we want to engage. But China will be a superpower, and superpowers have a special role to play, because sometimes it's money. It is about giving money to poorer nations to develop infrastructure, or to support climate change initiatives, or to be proponents of free trade, or whatever it might be. And we need that voice. And in a world where, say, China and the United States were much more closely aligned at the United Nations, for instance, that would be a very powerful world, and would give an organization that often doesn't have a lot of power because of the veto rights and the Security Council and the likes. It would actually make them a valued participant. So I think we all have to find ways of doing that, and that's at multiple levels. And that's probably the bigger worrying factor, I think, in the last few years, is that it's not just that there's a breakdown between president of the US and China, but all those layers below it are more damaged. Now, COVID hasn't helped that, but let's see if we can refuse those together, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it sounds really cliche, but it really would help so much, I reckon, if people just work together, respected each other, which is what China wants. But hopefully we'll see that soon. You said things changed between 2008, 2016. I'm really looking forward to it flipping back again. But now I just want to ask you the last 3 really quick-fire questions. These are the most important ones. What is your favorite Chinese food?
Peking duck.
Peking duck.
Yeah, and we went to a great place called in Beijing called Duck to Sheen. It's probably still there. Amazing place, most beautiful Peking duck in the world.
Nice. What's your favorite place in China?
I really like Shanghai. I think because it's sort of the Europe of the East. It's got that fantastic river and harbours and all those things. It's got an incredible buzz, amazing food. But it's got probably things that we like doing, shopping, and it's a bit of golf down the road, and it's just it's got incredible energy. And you go there in the lights at night. I've got some fantastic photos. I really like it. I mean, Beijing's an amazing place from a history point of view, and the seat of government. But like any place that has the seat of government, usually it's a bit more staid.
And the last question: what New Zealand product, which is currently not available in China, do you feel that Chinese people need in their lives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think I'm on the board of a little company that looks at origin and tracing, and there's technology there, and I think it's that sort of technology that we could put in there. I mean, obviously, food and fibre are our basic ingredients. Buy more of our wine, and you'll probably enjoy it. And all those other things. But I think if we could look beyond that and say, are there some technology things that we can do together and work together on? Because there's some great people in China, some really gifted, skilled people, and there are in New Zealand. And I think there could be real opportunities to work together on that. I mean, you've seen how strong technology is in China with Alibaba and Tencent and, WeChat and WePay and all these different sort of things. China's been a leader in that space, particularly in financial services. So there's real opportunities, I think.
Sir John Key, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, thank you so much for your time today, and I really look forward to seeing you in Shanghai sometime soon.
Pleasure.
Wow, what a fruitful discussion. Lots of interesting points there. Now I want to know what you guys think of former New Zealand Prime Minister Sir John Key. Let me know down below. Also, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.